Everyone, thank you all for being here and welcome to Publics at IIHS. We are extremely happy to have Professor Héran here with us to speak about his work around migration. So without wasting any time, I'm going to ask our faculty to...
Okay, thank you. So I have just to familiarize with the system. Okay. So let's begin with a very global view of the recent trends in migration. As you know, maybe since 1956, something like that, the United Nations compile all data coming from the different countries in the world. But since, I would say, 15 years, the compilation of data about migration is more and more precise. And I will take advantage of this strong improvement in the quality of data. So, as you can see here, the absolute number of migrants over the world is growing. It is now above around 260 million people who were born in one country and are living in another at least for 1 year, so on a permanent basis. And this is an international definition. It does not correspond exactly and not at all with the definition which is practiced by all the ministries of interior across the world. Because, for example, if you have a tourist visa and you overstay this visa after 3 months in most of European countries, after 6 months in India, you're already an illegal immigrant. But for the demographer, you're still not an immigrant, because an immigrant has to spend at least 1 year in the new country. So there is a sort of gray zone between the 4th month and the 12th month, which is rather complicated, where it is extremely difficult to enumerate in a correct way the migrants. And so it's a source of discrepancies between the estimates done by ministers of interior, let's say, or Homeland Security, etc., administrations, and demographers. But we'll elaborate a little more later. What is important in that if you look at what these migrants represent in percentage, well, it's rather low, 3.4. I'm sorry for the commas. This is a French system of the decimals, so it's difficult to convert it. So you will have to understand that sometimes my commas correspond to dots in your statistical presentation. So the migrants enumerated all over the world make up only 3.5% of the world population, which is a very low figure. Of course, we can we can inflate a little this figure, taking it into account the illegal persons, or we can even try to estimate the number of people who one day were migrated, and well, some of them get back. But as a whole, more than 90% of the world population never migrated. Migrated in the sense of an international migration. And being born in one country, foreign born in one country, crossing the border and settling in another country. Well, why? An explanation of this very low world average is due to the behavior of the demographic giants. And India is one of these demographic giants. In fact, if you look at the percentage of the Indian population which lives abroad, it's very low. It's very low. It's not even 2% of the Indian population which lives abroad. And China is even less. So these two huge planets are so huge that most of the inhabitants of these planets, if they want to improve their destiny, they migrate internally. It's the internal migration which, to some extent, plays the role played by external migration in other countries. And so, of course, as these two countries make up more or less nearly 40% of the world population, 38% of the world population, of course, it depresses the world average of migrant, the rate of migration at the global level. But you can see that you can see that, well, this is exactly the case for example, Nigeria. Nigeria has nearly 200 million inhabitants, 190 million inhabitants, and with a very, very low emigration rate. The same for Indonesia, Brazil, and the US. The US are by far the biggest immigration country, but they are not an emigration country. Very few Americans migrate outside the country. So this, of course, contributes to lower the general average. So Pakistan and Bangladesh are exceptions in this landscape. And here I mentioned some examples of countries who have, well, some of them important population. Mexico is about 120, something like that. And they have an important fraction of their population living abroad, nearly 10% for Mexico, 13% for Afghanistan. Of course, most of them are refugees. But you see, for example, countries like Romania or Albania in the Balkans, ex-communist Balkans, have a very high percentage of their population living abroad. It's one of the highest emigration rate. We are in France, we are fascinated by the emigration of sub-Saharan Africa, but in fact it's a very low emigration rate compared to what happens in the Balkans. Okay, so this is already a first image which is not exactly conform to the common wisdom. I present here as an introduction some, the bilateral relationship. We call them the corridors, migration corridors, from one country to another. How many people born in one country are living in another? Technically, it's not an annual flow. It's a stock, as we say. It's all the persons who presently reside in the country, are enumerated in the country. And of course, this is a result, the accumulation of moves from decades. It's all the results, a present result of history. And you can see here that by far the most important migration corridor in the world is composed from by the Mexicans living in the US. Nearly 12 million, so I had to cut the bar because in fact it goes over there, outside the framework. So you can realize the fantastic population it represents. The Mexican corridor to the US is really a huge corridor, and we'll try to explain, try to understand why. But you can see that India to the US is, of course, by very far below the Mexican corridor, but it's important, 2.4 million people, and all these are the main corridors to the United States of America, China, Philippines. You can see that Asia, Eastern Asia, and Southeastern Asia is well represented in these corridors. In Europe, the two important corridors we have, or three, are the Turks in Germany, the Algerians in France, and the Poles in Germany. These are the three main corridors, but Romanians in Italy is important too. But of course, it has nothing to do with, it's another scale as compared to the Mexican corridor. We have also important corridors from the ex-republics to Russia. And here are the corridors directed towards the countries of the Gulf. And you can see that India is very well represented in this bilateral migrations towards the countries of the Gulf. And I have also mentioned other corridors directed to Western Asia, and corridors focused on India and other countries of South Asia or Southeastern Asia. For Bangladesh to India is one of the most important corridors in the world in volume, in absolute numbers. I realize I'm shot, so if I walk, maybe it's not, well, what is important is the slides are much more important than my person, I think. So, if we add up all these corridors going from India to other countries, if we add up all these corridors, we arrive at this interesting result that, at the whole, nearly 16 million people are registered as immigrants in other countries. And this is the most important diaspora living abroad in the world. But of course, so before Mexico, Russia, China, Bangladesh, etc. And but of course, if you relate this with the size of India, with the huge population of India, the 1,300,000,000 people, well, it's only 1.2% of the Indian population. So you see the paradox, how difficult it is to have a good idea of the order of magnitude of migration across the world, because we have to tackle with countries with very different sizes, and this changes completely. So you have to cross all these approaches, this point of view, in order to have a good idea. Yes, the Indian migrants are very numerous, and they constitute the first national diaspora in the world, but compared to the population of origin, it's a very slim part of the population. Whether in Mexico, it's quite different. It represents 10% of the population. And you see here, for example, Syria, at the time, these figures were taken around 2015. And at the time, Syrian refugees were already there were a lot of Syrian refugees, and it was more or less 1/3 of the Syrian population who, now it's even more, 40% maybe of the Syrian population have fled to other countries. Most of them to neighboring countries, to Turkey, to Lebanon, to Jordan, etc. So, let's try to understand now what is the logic of all these moves, and if it is possible to find some rationality in this world distribution, in this world pattern of migration. There is an idea which is very deeply anchored in our brains, that poor people migrate to rich countries. And in fact, it's not that simple. And, well, the counterexamples are more important than the example, that's a problem. So it's not a law at all, but this law is extremely present in all our brains, in the political debate, in Europe, in the US, maybe here, I don't know. You will tell me, you shall tell me. So let's take referential, very simple referential. For example, the classification of countries according to the gross, the domestic product, the GDP per capita, in order to rank more or less the wealth of the countries. And so the World Bank every year publishes a new classification, and this is how this is the 4 grades, 4 degrees of wealth the World Bank is using presently, in US dollars, of course. So let's try to see how the flows of migrants, it's not the flows, it's the stocks. It's still the same data. The number of people who presently are living abroad are enumerated in all the censuses of the countries abroad. And you can see that the number of people migrating from the low-income countries to the highest income countries is very limited as compared to the other flows. Only 6.6 million of people born in the low-income countries are now living in a high-income country. It's a very low figure. Okay, and you have in this color, in violet, no? You have the reversal, the counter move. Very. So the most important migration we can observe in the world come from the lower middle level or from the upper middle level, so from the middle of the scale to the countries with the highest income. So it means that it's not the poorest of the poorest who migrate to the rich countries. It's more or less the emergent wealth or the people in an intermediary state. So if you classify, and we'll see it, the countries along a scale of wealth or development or education, so we always observe the same structure. It's a sort of bell curve. It's not, and this is completely in contradiction with the habitual say, which consists in claiming that if we are not vigilant, then all the misery of the world, in French we say la misère du monde, will automatically enter into our countries and invade us, more or less. But in fact, this is not what happens. And we can be more precise, because of course the absolute numbers give just a gross idea of what happens, but we have to reason in proportion with ratios. And so here you can see that, take for example the countries with the lowest income of level. Where do they migrate? 21% in other countries of the same level, 35% in this lower middle stratum, and only 26% in the country with the highest level of income. Whereas, for example, people of the highest level never migrate to the lowest. It's very impressive. But 82%, when they migrate to another country, another rich country. So this is important to have this in mind, that in fact there is also an important migration within the rich countries, within Europe, between Europe and the US, for example, and this kind of migration. And you can see the very gradual ranking. So the poorer a country is, the less it migrates to a rich country. This is a true law, which has nothing to do with habitual law, that the misery of the world is going to us. So what is the fantastic poem of Emma Lazarus, which is written down in the basement of the Statue of the Liberty in New York. It's a wonderful poem, but it corresponds to this false idea. It was certainly correct, right, at the time the statue was built. But in fact, it does not correspond any longer to the reality of migration flows in contemporary time. And a more elaborate presentation of the same data. So it's important to see that when we progress from absolute numbers and to percentages and then to ratios of which matter the overrepresentation of phenomena, we see the structure much better. And we could still use other devices like odd ratios, but I will stop here. So you can see here that the people born in a country with low income are overrepresented nearly 5 times in the migrants living in other countries with a low income. You understand? While they are underrepresented, every time you are below 1, it's an underrepresentation in the rich countries. And reversely, the people living in rich countries have quasi null or are not likely to migrate to countries with low income, but they are much more likely to migrate to people to high income countries. And here there is something rather, well, revealing or funny. It's the fact that in the World Bank does not attribute gross domestic product to the overseas possessions, which are detailed in the demographic data of United Nations. The United Nations have the custom, the French government doesn't like it. It always calculates, it gives all the demographic data for the mainland and separately for all the overseas possession. La Guadeloupe, la Martinique, la Réunion, Mayotte, la Guyane, French Guyana, and so on, more or less with the idea that one day they could gain their independence. And this is more or less the idea of the United Nations. So we have very interesting statistics of the bilateral matrix of migrations, which tells who born in one territory or country is living in another country or territory, gives us information about overseas territory, but I don't have any measure of the wealth of this territory. So I put them apart, and it's very interesting to see that, yes, there is a fantastic over-migration of people from which country to the overseas, and maybe it has something to do with the tax system. And so it's an interesting index of some a kind of migration from the rich countries. Though this is eloquent, it's a very eloquent graph about the structure of migration. Now let's try to give you a synthetic view of the way the migration flows are oriented. And here I shall use the Human Development Index. There is a lot of critiques about this index, but up to now, it's certainly the index which synthesized in the most eloquent way the position of the countries along a scale of development, let's say, because it combines, it's a sort of score combining years of education, of schooling, or expectancy of life, and the income per capita of the country. So it's an interesting combination. And so what I've done is to classify, although it's a very precise index, but in order to put things simpler, I have classified all these countries along a scale from 1 to 10. Okay? So France, for example, is not at a level 10. France, it occupies rank 9. In 10, you find Germany, UK, the US, etc. France is at level 9. So I'm looking the numbers, absolute numbers of population who were born in one country of origin and migrate in a destination country. And here you can see the richest countries in the world, or the more developed countries in the world, combining expectancy of life, rich wealth, and education, and so on. And you can see that the most important tower is from level 6 to level 10 includes, in fact, the Mexicans to the US. They are here because Mexico is at level 6 in the development scale. For example, 4 to 10, so people from this level migrate, they migrate where? To level 8 here, which correspond to the countries of the Gulf, or to the rich countries like the US. It includes Filipinos, Indians in the US, Canada, in Canada, in UK, etc. Or 3 to 10 here includes Pakistanis in the same country, US, Canada, and UK, but also the Syrians who found refuge in Germany, in Austria, in Sweden, etc. So if the poorest countries were migrating to the richest one, which is the general idea we have, we should have here a huge accumulation of people. People from born in a country with level 1 or 2. Sub-Saharan Africa is mostly here. They should be here, the migrants of this area should be here, and it's not the case. So this area is, what we observe is an over-migration of the poor countries towards other countries of the same level. More or less a diagonal, but you can see here the bell curve. So once again, it's a sort of a way of I'm just confirming all what has been told, said up to now. There is no such law as a sort of natural gravitation from the poorest country to the richest country. And this is, sorry, yes? We could do, we could check, do exactly the same, for example, looking at the fertility rate, the fertility level, the total fertility rate, which is the most common indicator of fertility. If we take into account all the transition of fertility and ranging all the countries according to whether they have entered into the transition in a very since a long time or very recently, or if etc. Well, if we classify all the countries along the story of their fertility rate, we observe exactly the same. It's not the most fertile country that migrate to the less fertile country. You cannot imagine all the essays which have been written about on this idea that, for example, countries with low demographic pressure, like Europe, will automatically attract people from high demographic pressure areas. Even some writings from the European Commission are following this line. It's absolutely contrary to the truth. There is nothing true in this. We observe exactly the opposite. And I've already mentioned the case of the Balkan countries. They have one of the world records of the lowest low fertility levels, 1.1, 1.2, 1.3 children per woman. And in spite of that, they migrate to countries with a higher level of fertility, and not the opposite, not the other way around. So, but if you want to inculcate this idea, this new pattern, these new views on the pattern of a migration, it's very difficult. It's so, I fight to, but an evidence-based policy is something very, well, unusual. Okay, we have a lot of theories about the mechanisms which can explain migration at the macro level, migration at the intermediate or meso level, migration at the micro level, it means at the level of individual. And one of the most important attempt to introduce some order within the very numerous theories of migration that have been developed since decades was the essay published by Douglas Massey. In fact, the IOSSP, the International Union for Scientific Study of Population, mandated Douglas Massey at the beginning of the 90s to create a special committee and try to identify all the motors, the engines of migration. And they made a huge review of the literature at that time from all the continents, trying to understand, to identify the resource. And they, Douglas Massey then prolonged his career in Princeton. He's very famous because he settled the Mexican migration project. It was one of the first attempts to study migration, not from the country of destination, but from the country of origin. So an observatory of all the migration movements in Mexico with, of course, strong collaboration with all the Mexican scholars. And this has been published first in 1993. It's a very often cited article. There is also a book by the IOSSP, International Union for the Scientific Study of Population. Oh, sorry. Yes, okay, it's okay. And more or less, these are the theories that are enumerated by Douglas Massey's report, and this classification has been extremely influent. In fact, when you look at all the manuals of demography, manuals on migration studies, etc., you can see that this classification is very often used. It's still the basis of a lot of studies. And Douglas Massey and his team have done two things. First, a sort of analysis of literature with, well, some judgments of value about each theory, about the acceptability of this theory. But what Douglas Massey did also, thanks to his Mexican migration project, was trying to test all this theory in his observatory, because he had a longitudinal observation of migrants during years and years, and he could calculate the probability of migrating from one year to another according to a series of factors, which was very thinly, very finely described in his observatory. So, I shall not enter into each of these theory, but there are something a little strange in the way it is classified. First of all, the neoclassical economic theory of migration, as it is seen by Douglas Massey, stands that the migrant has a perfect idea of his interest, and he follows a rational line, and he calculates, well, what will cost, the cost and benefits of the migration. So the difference of wages between origin and destination, minus all the cost due to distance, the transportation, but also a series of other factors. And if we look at the neoclassical literature about migration, what they did was progressively integrated into this manual, into the cost of migration, not only the economic cost due to distance or transportation, but the cultural cost, for example, which is something more, or the linguistic proximity, the linguistic distance being, of course, a dimension of the distance. For example, the proximity created by an old colonial link, to some extent, of course, shorten the distance between two countries. It creates a community of language, etc. And so it lowers, it alleviates the cost of migration, etc. It's interesting to see that all the people who have used the equations, equilibrium equation of this neoclassical economic theory, progressively have integrated into their model cultural factors, historical factors, factors which are not per se economic, but which economic consequences, but the economic consequences of these factors can be evaluated or estimated in an economic way. So this is more or less. So Douglas Massey criticizes neoclassical economic theory in a very swift way, without really analyzing the fantastic capacity of this theory to integrate other factors and including non-economic factors. And so he praises the new economic theory of migration, which has been developed from the 18th by an Israeli economist, Oded Stark, who had the merit to include the idea that migration is not only an individual strategy, it's a family strategy. There is a discussion between the spouses, a negotiation between spouses. There is the bargaining power, the respective bargaining power of women and men is very important to calculate the probability, the likeliness of migration, and so on. And he also insisted on the fact that the information provided to the migrants, information acquired by the migrant, and there is a cost of the information. The cost of information means, okay, it is costly to have good information about, for example, the labor market in the destination country. So Oded Stark found that, in fact, it's not necessary to send somebody to the destination country or to get some information. This was before internet, of course. Huh? But when you see the migrants who come back to the village, for example, only for holidays, or even those who return definitely, they give you an information about the success of migration, the advantages you can acquire by migrating, and this kind of information has been introduced into the model of Oded Stark. When you look at this carefully, you realize that in fact, most of these ideas are already present, for example, in Jakob Mintzer articles. Mintzer is certainly the first neoclassical economist who would take into account the fact that migration is decided by a couple. And he explained himself that one day wife had been appointed to the other coast of the US, and he decided to follow his wife, which was not the habitual way of doing. And this gave him the idea of saying, but after all, what is exactly the role of the spouse in taking the decision to migrate? So to me, of course, these developments are very interesting, and Douglas Massey insists a lot on these developments. But if you look really the way it is formalized, the kind of reasoning, it is still a chapter of neoclassical economic model. And we could say the same about Michael Piore's theory of the labor market segmentation. Michael Piore is an Italian economist who worked in the MIT, Massachusetts Institute of Technology, and he wrote a very influential book in 1979, which explained that, in fact, the labor market is dual, and there is strong segmentation, a divide between the protected sector, with trade unions, with stable jobs and so on, and unstable work, non-protected work, and in this area, which is absolutely necessary for capitalism to operate migration is absolutely necessary. So there is, it's an explanation by the demand of labor, which is an essential demand of labor. And some disciples of Piore have developed the theory later and explained that in fact there are two kinds of immigrants. Immigrants who succeed in reaching the protected sector, and migrants who are still without papers, without documents, in very unstable and informal situations. And so this divide is not only a divide between natives and migrants, but between two categories of migrants, those included and those not included in the system. And this theory has been developed to some extreme by Saskia Sassen, an American scholar from Dutch origin. And but she, well, it would take hours to speak about Saskia Sassen. She developed the idea that finally all the kind of exploitation you can observe about on the pressure exerted on migrant is part of a general system of exploitation which is responsible for a series of disasters, including ecological disasters. It's very important in the new all the books of Saskia Sassen are best-selling books. They are extremely influential. And Douglas Massey himself, well, pays some tribute to this theory, but he insists himself on the social capital theory. And the social capital theory, well, he mentions Bourdieu, the French sociologist, who wrote an article in 1980, and then there was a German version, and then a developed English version in 83, 85, which was extremely influential, more than 40,000 citations in Google, which is by far the most cited article of Bourdieu, and it is very often used against Putnam's version of social capital. So what is here? Robert Putnam. For Robert Putnam, the American sociologist, social capital is something positive. And he even created a special NGO dedicated to developing the social capital in the US. So social capital is a capacity of bridging between people or bonding people. There are two versions. For example, religious people for Douglas Massey are very nice people. Nice for him is a technical term because he can measure the generosity of people who are linked, strongly linked by religious association, for example, etc. So it is a real, very positive view of social capital, and it has been taken over by the OECD, which has developed a lot of studies about the development of social capital as a factor which explains a lot of things in, for example, in the status of health and a lot of things. Bourdieu, Douglas Massey never mentioned Putnam. This is a position between Princeton and Harvard, I would say, but he mentions Bourdieu. And in fact, in Bourdieu, the social capital theory is completely different from Putnam's. It consists in saying that social capital is distorting the ordinary flow, the ordinary behavior, the ordinary mechanism of social relations. Social capital is a normal concentration of relationships by the elite, and all the examples mentioned by Bourdieu on social capital are taken from the elite, aristocracy, the bourgeoisie, alumni, and so on and so on. And so for Bourdieu, it's a sort of a capital which unduly multiply the return of other forms of capital, cultural capital, economic capital, etc. Why I'm talking of this? Because, in fact, if you look the way Douglas Massey invokes the social capital theory, it's very simple in his survey. It's just the fact that another member of the family has already migrated to the US, for example, etc. And so the family link makes, fuels the migration, entertain the migrations. And this leads to the last theory, which is theories elaborated by Douglas Massey himself, which he claims is the cumulative causation theory, the fact that the social capital attracts more and more migrants. All the factors which develop migrations are accumulating, and so to some extent it comes to the point that there is a sort of culture of migration which is cultivated in some areas, and it's very difficult to stop it. It's a little problematic because it works very well to explain the way the Mexican migration has been fueled and refueled by family links, family unification. Family unification is the most important driver of migration from Mexico to US. But it happens now that before Trump's presidency, the Mexican flows to the US have slowed down and so Douglas Massey in a very recent article said, okay, my theory is not able to explain why at a certain point the system is saturated and why this cumulative causation and the fact that migration is constantly self-fueled, to some extent this mechanism is stopped. That doesn't work any longer. This was more or less, in a very short and summarized way, the presentation. Okay, so he has tested all these theories in his material. I won't enter into the details because, in fact, the way you operationalize this theories, the way you identify the variables that can indicate social capital or segmentation in the local labor market or things like that. It's quite difficult. It's always problematic. It's not that easy. But finally, as a result, he dismisses very radically the neoclassical economic theory. He praises a new economic theory of migration, which is in fact a special chapter of it. He says that the theory of labor market segmentation and wealth system theory can explain to some extent the probability of migrating. For example, he observes that there is a higher probability of migrating in the areas in which American firms have already settled. So to some extent, it gives to the Mexican workers some habits of familiarity with industrial work, which facilitates the migration to the US. You know, this kind of explanation. And of course, he agrees with himself and justifies the fact that a cumulative causation theory is one of the most, but it's only in fact, when you look very carefully, they just explain that the probability of migrating to a country X is much higher when one of your parents have already migrated to this country. This is, to put it in simple terms, the main result of it. So, of course, a lot of factors are now calling our attention, and especially because of the migration crisis, the refugee crisis of the year 2015, etc. When you look, for example, at this survey which has been released in April 2018, and you ask the people the reasons why they migrated, of course, you can see that everybody around me was leaving. So there is a sort of cumulative process, of course. You can see there are personal or family reasons, but these reasons are very complicated. For example, you want to join somebody you already know. But of course, you have some economic reasons, but lack of rights, violence, and general insecurity is much more important, while environmental and natural disaster is very, very limited as a cause of migration, despite all the debates around this theory. So you can see this is another vision which does not square really with all the reason for migration, for migrating, which had been elaborated by Massey. And Douglas Massey recently wrote an article saying that, okay, in the new century, we need new models of migrations, and he tries to call attention to these kinds of mechanisms, which are quite different from cumulative causation, for example. Okay, so just if you're not tired or not bored, I will just say some words about the migration crisis Europe has undergone recently. If you take the year 2016, which corresponds to the bulk of the migration crisis, these are figures which are very easy to find in the website of the High Commissariat for Refugees. More than 75 million people displaced in the world, 40 internally displaced. It means within the same country, in another region of the same country, due to conflict, wars, etc. You have 2.8 asylum seekers and 22.5 refugees, but, well, refugees registered as potential refugees by the United Nations. There are several definitions, and part of them are under the HCR mandate, and there is the special situation of the Palestinian refugees. Sorry for the writing. And 10 million apatrides, people who are not presently attached to one country. What is important in this figure is the fact that from all these persons, well, 84% are hosted by countries of the south, by neighboring countries, etc. And the share taken by Europe or the north, country of the source, is only 16%. And this is something we always forget, of course. You can see this in the maps. I'm sorry that it's not very visible, but you can see the displaced person, so displaced in the same country, in the country of the conflict, and you can see so the areas of conflict in that year. And of course, Syria is the most important one, but Iraq too, Congo, Sudan, etc. appear. Then you can see the countries in which you have these refugees or potential refugees, or the neighboring countries in most of the cases. Of course, you have some countries in Europe, but the bulk of the countries who host refugees are neighboring countries, Turkey, Lebanon, Jordan, etc., Iran with people from Afghanistan or Pakistan, etc., India with people from Burma, etc. And if you look at the location of the asylum seekers, those who really have been recognized as a pre-status of asylum seeker. They have been registered as asylum seekers. Okay, you see Germany, you see Italy, Turkey, France has played a very limited, restricted role in this period. So you can see the way, the order of magnitude of all these phenomena. And now I'm reaching the last slides. If you look at what happened in 2016, the absolute number of asylum applications. The absolute number, well, was Germany, as registered 55,000 people, and once again, the bar of Germany goes here, it's out of the frame, and I had to cut the bar in order to represent it, okay, understand? And from these people, they gave in 2016 positive decisions for more or less half of the people, okay? France comes in second for the number of applications registered, but in a rather low position for the number of positive decisions. Well, but the problem is this corresponds to these absolute numbers, and all these countries have very different sizes. And we have to take this into account. So if you take this into account, if you calculate, which Eurostat does, but not in a very visible way. But if you calculate the number, for example, of positive decisions per million population, you have these results, and you realize that Sweden is the first country by the proportional number of positive decisions of protection, followed by Germany, Austria, Malta, Cyprus. So Malta and Cyprus are these little island states in the oriental part of the Mediterranean, exposed in first line to the immigrant and forced by the big countries to apply the famous Dublin regulation, which obliges the first country which has registered the entry to treat the application. So it's rather paradoxical. Switzerland, Norway, etc. France is here. And when I show this graph, for example, recently I was invited by 48 MPs in the French Assembly. They don't want to believe me. Because I calculate the prices per meter square or square meter, okay? When you compare the quantity of salt in two products, quantity of salt per 100 grams, etc. You are accustomed to do this kind of correction in your daily life, and we don't do it for estimating the weight or the burden of the asylum application in our country. But of course, and this, at the right, you can see all these countries, the ex-communist country with this red label. There are some reasons why they don't give any protection to asylum. They have no colonial past, so no migration, and they have not at all been familiarized with non-European migration after the war. They did not reconstruct the economy in the post-war period with the help of non-European migrants, contrary to what Germany, France, and other countries did. But also they have this anti-Islam ideology, etc. There are several reasons which accumulate to explain this situation. And you can see also that Portugal here, or Spain here, has a very low position, because these countries were for a long time countries of immigration and not emigration. Nobody asked asylum in Spain or in Portugal, in the countries of Franco or Salazar, nobody. And so they are not equipped now. They don't have the legal equipment to welcome, to treat the asylum request. And this is one of the reasons why they are not okay. So, but you can say, well, Sweden, Germany, Austria, Switzerland, Norway, Luxembourg are very rich countries. If you take into account the wealth of these countries, is the classification the same? So this is the red bars here. You can see it modifies the classification. Norway, for example, does that good, taking into account its wealth. Okay, you understand the reasoning here. But at the whole, France remains in a very low position, in the 15th rank, something like that. Bulgaria is increasing its performance because considering its population and its wealth, it has done a lot of efforts, etc. So you have to calculate this in order to have a good idea of it. Okay, and now I'm just what happens during all this year from 2014 up to now. The statistics corresponds to trimester. So you can see that here, and this is the number of asylum requests. Not the protection, just the registration of asylum seekers. You can see here that since 2014, before Merkel's statement, we should welcome all these people, wir schaffen das, we are able to welcome 800,000 people. The famous declaration statement made by Angela Merkel in August, at the end of August 2015. You realize that in fact Germany had already begun to welcome the asylums, and Merkel's statements occurs exactly at mid-slope of this evolution. It means that the German society with its huge charities, potential of welcoming, were already operating during all this period. France did not made any effort. Then Germany had this deal with Turkey. With a very striking effect. Italy took its part in the process, and Greece, etc. But I shall introduce other countries, and you can see that here Sweden, in line with a long tradition of welcoming refugees, were reacting very strongly to the calls launched by the HCR, the High Commissariat for Refugees. Austria too, you see here. Sweden is climbing very high. I could not represent and then it fell down. And the Netherlands too, in black, you have, yes, the Netherlands is in black. But so what happens now? The countries who really support the burden proportionally are Cyprus, Malta, Greece. And France is here. We are progressively reaching the European average. And UK is a fantastic case. UK did nothing during all the crisis. Taking advantage of its insularity, of its remoteness from the theater of the operations, while the Scandinavian countries, despite they are very far from the theater of operations, took their part in welcoming the refugees. So this is a real story of all this process, all this. But if you look at how the public debate develops in France, for example, there is a general idea that we are absolutely overwhelmed by the migrants. The system is saturated. We cannot do nothing. And so we are trying to find what are the elements of attractivity which are presently attracting migrants. Is it a special right of the soul? Is it the little sum of money, amount of money, daily money, or amount of money we give to the asylum seeker? Is it the generosity of our social protection, and so on and so on? But in fact, no, we are not that attractive. We are just attractive in the average, and the burden is really relying on the shoulders of other countries. And we can see, for example, in the island of Lesbos, what happens presently. So, and this is the end. I'm ready to ask to your questions if you want.
Questions?
Yes.
So you mentioned briefly about return migration. So when migrants return to their country of origin.
Yes.
So you mentioned briefly about it. Could you talk a little more about it? Because does it ever happen that is it very common in occurrence, return migration, or are the numbers very negligible? So could you talk a little more about it?
Well, in Europe, the migration in Europe is quite different from the migration flows we observe in Asia. In Asia, most of the flows are correspond to work migrations. And for example, the countries of the Gulf prohibit any kind of family unification. So there is the idea, which corresponds to the migrants' intention themselves, that okay, they will work for some years, accumulate a little capital, and then once it is done, get back to their country. And this is more or less the general scheme or the idea of a conception of migration from South Asia to the countries of the Gulf. And there is no idea of integrating the migrants, give them rights, etc. They are strictly separated from the rest of the population and so on. Well, this was more or less the scheme we had in the 60s or beginning of the 70s in Europe. At that time, For example, if you look at the Swiss example, the French example, the way we behaved with Algerian migrants, Italian migrants, Spanish migrants, that was, okay, we recruit them temporarily during the year, we dismiss them during the holidays, we recruit them once again in fall, in autumn, and so on and so on. And what is very important that at that time, Europe was creating, the unification of Europe was made up by precisely Italy, France, Belgium, and so on. And Italian diplomacy played a very active role in order to get social rights for their migrants. And they protested, saying, no, you cannot continue to do this. Paying the people just during the year, dismissing them during the holidays and recruiting them again. This is absolutely contrary to all the social rules. And so a series of bilateral agreements, this is a very important component of the history of policy migrations everywhere. The bilateral agreements have succeeded in obliging the destination country to give social rights to the migrants. I don't know to what extent, for example, India, there is officially a policy of India in order to protect the Indian minorities abroad. And there is even an administration which is in charge of this. But to what extent it takes the shape of bilateral agreements that can really protect the social rights of the migrants in the destination country, I don't know. This is certainly a subject for historians, geographers, political scientists of your country okay. So what we observed in Europe was that of course, at the beginning, a lot of people were returning. We estimate still now that more or less of all the European migrants who entered into Europe from the 60s up to now, 1/3, more or less, came back to their country, 1/3. But it means that the 2/3 remained. They settled, they founded families, the children grew up, got to school, began to speak French, and despite the first intentions, the migrants finally stayed in their country, and they were to some extent trapped by the family, by the children, and so on. It is a very common phenomenon that migrants stay much more than they had predicted themselves in their initial project. So more or less, yes, 1/3. What we observe is that the stricter the conditions of entry, the lower the frequency of returns. It means that if you close the border, if you put very strict conditions to the obtention of permits of stay, okay, you reduce the flows, but you raise the stocks. A policy which is just concentrated, focused on the reduction of flows, increases the stocks. Why? Because people who are the people don't want to get back to their country because they fear not to be able to come back to France, to UK, to Germany, and so on. So if you close the border, you limit, you reduce the circulation, and so people don't want to come back to their country because they don't want to lose the rights they have acquired in their destination country. So there is a paradox, a perverse effect. The more you close the border, the more you impede the people to get out. And this is exactly what happens in the United States. Presently, the number of undocumented migrants in the United States is bigger and bigger because the people don't want to get back to Mexico, for example. Otherwise, they could not come back to the US. So it increases. It's a paradox because the idea is, on the contrary, to reduce the number of undocumented migrants. Have I answered your question? More or less. More or less, it's in Europe. It's a third part of the migrants came back to their country. It's difficult to say if they came back because they succeeded or because they failed. And sometimes we have very strange attitudes. For example, Turkish migrants who come back in Turkey have been interviewed in Turkey, and some of them explain that, well, the integration of my children in France was too successful. My children were becoming French. I didn't want them to become French. I wanted them to stay Turkish, to have it. So they decided to blockade, to interrupt the integration process of France and get back to Turkey. And it's a catastrophe because the children are entering the Turkish school, where at that time in the 80s there was still body punishments, etc., and very archaic ways of ruling the schools and so on. And the children were in a poor situation. And the parents realized later that it was not a good idea to get back to Turkey, because after all, the integration in France, yes, could have changed the mentality of my children, but at least they would not have suffered as they are suffering now in Turkey, and so on and so on. So you see, it's extremely interesting to have all this anthropological survey and qualitative analysis of what happens. I've thought about statistics, but we are interested in establishing a link between statistics and the qualitative aspect. Another question? Yes?
Firstly, I wasn't privy to what you said earlier. I came a little late, so pardon me if I ask you something that you already gave out. Are there any specific norms for qualifying which are different in these countries? For example, in the UK, you got to have a well-founded, well-reasoned fear of persecution to be admitted. In the other countries, are there well-defined norms which say that you're qualified to apply if you fulfill these norms? Firstly. Secondly, do you have any statistics on the religious breakup of people applying for this asylum? And thirdly, have you done any study on the effects of migration, especially in a place like France, where the South France, the Riviera, you have 1 in 3 individuals whose grandfather is a non-French origin person. So there are a lot of problem areas associated with that. Has there been any study to bring out certain trends in these things? 3 questions.
First, you mentioned the law obtaining in England in order to give a positive decision to asylum seeker, they have to check whether they have a serious reason.
Can you speak a little louder?
Yes, you have to check whether they have a serious reason to fear persecution in their country. This is exactly the general this is exactly the Convention of Geneva. Okay,
that's only applicable in places where there is strife. In Guinea, for example,
yes, but England is supposed to, and what the citation you make is exactly a citation of the Geneva Convention. The problem is that it is left to the free appreciation of each national authority to appreciate, to estimate the degree of persecution, the degree of reliability of the narrative of persecution narrative, and this is extremely difficult. And you have to take into account that we don't have only the Convention of Geneva. We have also 2 or 3 other kinds of protection, subsidiary protection and territorial protection in some countries. It means that each country adds to the Convention of Geneva a special normative, special reasons for protection according to their national laws, which can differ from one country to another. And what we observed during the migration crisis was that, in fact, the proportion of subsidiary protection in the name of, for the sake of national laws and not the General Convention of Geneva, has risen, and it's now more than half of the protection given in Europe correspond to national laws of protection and not the Geneva Convention, because the conditions put to the application of the Geneva Convention are stricter and stricter. So this is a... But yes, it's always a mystery to see that in principle, all these countries are submitted to the same international law, the same international conventions, for example, for the protection of the child, for the rights to family unification, and so on, with very, very different results. For example, England uses the family unification in a very low proportion as compared to France, 3 times or 4 times less than France. Whereas, of course, the need to live with its family is something in principle universal, and so how do you explain these differences between countries? This is the kind of question you ask. It is due to the severity of the system, to the criteria applied. It's not only the question of the universal definition of the criteria, but the way they are applied at the street level by the street level bureaucracy. And this plays a very important role. The second question was about...
do you have any statistics on religion-wise applicants for asylum?
We have some surveys. It depends from the surveys undertaken in each country. There is no statistics, unified statistics by Eurostat, for example, the Statistical Office of the European Communities. So in some surveys, yes, we see, but of course, all people coming from Syria, from Afghanistan, from Israel, are Muslims by, except some Christian minorities. So, but normally in the official statistics, this is not published. It's afterwards you can realize. It doesn't mean that it's not taken as some countries have special programs focused on welcoming Christian minorities, for example. But it's very exceptional, and it's not, well, the religious persecution is one of the motives, of the 6 motives which is mentioned by the Convention of Geneva. It's not only, the Convention of Geneva is not only a convention about political refugees. We often use this expression, political refugees, but in fact, if you look at the Convention of Geneva, it includes persecution for sexual reasons, for because you belong to a special social category, and this was introduced because of the communist regimes. So it must be an indirect political persecution, not necessarily because you have militated in the political arena against the regime, you know. And of course, the persecution for religious reasons is one of the main important reasons for obtaining protection. And in this case, yes, there are statistics saying that there is a certain percentage of people who have been have received protection because of on a religious ground, because of the... And the third one is...
The third one, allied with the first one, a little clarification. For example, in the UK you have a uniform, or in France you have a uniform civil code. Now, supposing a person from a country wherein he follows his personal laws were to apply for asylum, and he has, from his perspective, a well-founded, well-reasoned fear of persecution because he's married 5 times.
Yeah.
And the country to which he's applying only allows a single wife, where that is the law. Now for him, he has a well-founded, well-reasoned fear of persecution because in his country he's being hounded because he's married more than one woman. So he's applied, so his perspective-wise, he's got a well-founded, well-reasoned fear of persecution. So what are the pros and cons of getting asylum? And the third question was, have you done a study on the effects of migration, especially a place like France in South, the Riviera and all that? You have 1 to 3 whose great-grandfather is, a grandfather is non-French in origin.
Okay, so
either Algerian, Moroccan.
Presently in France, and this has been calculated through several ways, presently nearly 25% of the population living in France is either a migrant or the children of at least one migrant. Okay, a quarter, nearly a quarter of the population is either, well, more or less 10% or 11% of the population is migrant. They were foreign born, they cross the border, they are settled in the country, and if you add the children they had in France, children who can obtain the French citizenship automatically at age 18, but even before if they want, 12%, 13% of the whole population. So we are reaching at 23% of the French population. And this changes a lot the view we have, because people who, for example, want to calculate what is exactly the cost of immigration to the rest of the population, it begins a little strange to try to calculate what a quarter of the population costs to the 3/4 left. And if you include a question about the grandparents, it has not been made yet. There is now on the field an important survey which includes now a question about the countries of birth of the grandparents and the first citizenship of grandparents. So we'll know, but more or less we can estimate that 1/3 of the French, of the population living in France, 1/3 as at least a grandparent or parent from abroad, born abroad. So it's an important proportion. And but you can imagine, sometimes I make this comparison. Can you imagine a family, well, I don't know to what extent this is eloquent in India, but a family who has 3 children, they adopt a 4th one, and they will not spend all their time trying to calculate what the 4th child is costing to the first 3, you know. It would be strange. So yes, we are growing by accretion. We integrate all these people, despite all the difficulties. It's not that easy, but at least, and the composition of the population changes, but also the attitudes of the migrants themselves changing. They adapt, in despite all what is said about it. There is, of course, difficulties for the second generation born in France, because the parents used to compare their destiny with the destiny of the people who remained in their country of origin, while the children themselves, as another group of reference, they compare the destiny to the destiny of their comrades, to the peers of the same age. And of course, if they realize that with the same age, the same certificate, diploma, they don't have the same probabilities of acquiring the goods the society can give them, employment, promotion, housing, and so on, of course, they feel discriminated against. So this is the situation in which we are. Now the question is South Asia, Western Asia, is it possible that progressively the next decade, not now, but in the next decade, they evolve towards models which does not consider migrants just as a temporary support, but as really a new component of the population? This is a big question, but it's not up to me to answer this question, it's up to you. Okay. Yes? The last one, please?
Yeah, last question.
Thanks for your talk. Questions regarding the migration due to environmental reasons, where let's say a country like Maldives, which is predicted to go underwater in a few years. So all the current population of Maldives will be looking for some place to migrate. So what are the laws, so if they want to migrate to, say, the US or Canada or to any of the EU countries, so are these laws being framed in these countries to accommodate these kind of refugees in the future?
Yeah. Maldives is the example constantly cited, mentioned, and of course it's an extreme example, but altogether an interesting example, like all extreme cases. No, till now you don't have anything in the international law that could give a special status for climatic migration and climatic refugees. And many groups, NGOs, some are thinking about writing down, improving the legislation about refugees. Well, the problem is that the Geneva Convention is under attack from in a lot of countries, and specialists of the people who are attached to the Geneva Convention fear that the convention could be rewritten for the sake of climate, etc., because some countries could take advantage of this rewriting in order to reduce the rights of the traditional refugees. So it's really under debate. It's really a moot point. Now, from the objective point of view, of course, there is a case of the Maldives. The problem is, except some very limited cases, most of the climate change up to now does not provoke necessarily an international migration. It displaces people. And last year, the World Bank published a very interesting report about internal displacement for climatic reasons. And they calculated, for example, the elevation of the sea level, how many people would be displaced by this, etc. But most of this displacement would be internal displacement, and not necessarily international migration in the sense I have used in this presentation. So up to now, it's very difficult to make an estimate of the international migration due to for climatic reasons in the next decades. Yes?
In countries in Palestine, for example, Palestinian refugees who are not allowed by the countries which give them refuge to partake of their general economy, and they do not integrate them into they're kept in camps and so on in many cases. Isn't there any law that governs this, international law? We also did this for Sri Lankan refugees who came to Tamil Nadu. They were not allowed to mix and send their children to regular schools or take jobs and so on. What kind of laws govern this? Because this has been going on for generations for the Palestinians, and it has become a major threat to their own lives and livelihoods and mental and emotional well-being.
Yes, the Palestinian case, so it is, there are between 4 or 5 million people, something like that, under the mandate of the UNWRA, which is a special agency of the United Nations that protect them. In Jordan, for example, they have access to the economic life in an important proportion. They are much more integrated than in other countries. And the way most Palestinians tackle this issue is to migrate themselves to other countries. There is an important Palestinian migration to the US, for example, to Canada also. Especially the part of the population which is Catholic or Christian. The half of the Arab population settled in the US is Christian. Half of them. So it's an interesting example. So yes, but you're right. It's a situation which is not. It's not at all a model. In most of the cases, refugees, once they have got the status of refugees, of course, have exactly the same rights in European countries as the rest of as the natives. And for the second generation, there is no. A colleague of mine is a son of a Palestinian Palestinian refugee, and she is absolutely integrated in France, but she still and feels still Palestinian completely at the same time. So we have all these interesting cases of double integration to some extent, which is a possible solution for the future.
I think we've run out
Yes.
of time now. Okay. Thank you everybody for being here, and thank you, Professor, for such a insightful lecture. Just a small announcement. We have a public text event happening on 17th October at 6 p.m. where author Roshan Ali will be here to speak about his debut novel. So I hope some of you can make it for that. Thank you. Have a great evening.